Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. You are standing in a room that no longer exists. The walls were once made of baked brick and polished limestone, painted with ochre lines and symbols you would not recognize. The floors were swept smooth. The air smelled of cedar, incense, and parchment. And at the center of the far wall, visible only by torchlight, was a seal. Not a wax stamp, not an emblem, but a literal carved seal stone set into the plaster, bearing a name no one has ever spoken aloud in 3,000 years. And someone tried very hard to make sure no one ever would. The seal is partially scraped, its cuneiform symbols distorted by deliberate gouging. The lines that once formed part of a title, most likely nin or erasure, now fractured. The last two syllables of the name have been chipped away. This seal was discovered in the ruins of Tel al-Rima, a Bronze Age city in northern Mesopotamia, near the modern border between Iraq and Syria. It was excavated in the 1960s by a British team led by archaeologist David Oates. Among the broken remnants of temples and granaries, they found a small administrative building, likely an archive. It was filled with tablets. Most were economic records, lists of barley, livestock workers assigned to canal digging. These were routine, boring, even, but they told a story. And one particular record stood out. It was a receipt, scribed in Akkadian, for the delivery of goods to a royal estate. The estate's name was intact. The overseer's name was intact, but the name of the recipient, one who signed the seal, was erased. Not just scratched out, smeared. Wet clay had been rubbed before baking. The seal had been pressed, and then half the inscription had been blurred with a damp thumb. The result was clear. This record was not meant to preserve a name. It was meant to erase it. That's where the mystery begins. You see, we know a great deal about Bronze Age bureaucracy. The scribes of the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE were meticulous record keepers. They recorded harvests, temple donations, land transfers, legal disputes, marriage contracts, even purchases of fish or oil. And at the very top of the system, above the merchants and priests and governors, were the royals. Men were listed often, women rarely. But when they were listed, when they signed with their own seals or received tributes in their own right, it usually meant something. It meant power. It meant autonomy. It meant someone important enough that their name was the record. So, when that name is missing, scraped, blurred, erased, it raises the question, who was she? And why was her name not only forgotten, but forcibly removed? Here is what we do know. Sometime around 1780 BCE, Tel al-Rima was a modest but thriving city-state. It sat at a crossroads between larger powers, Mari to the west, Ishnana to the east, Assur to the north. The king at the time was named Adad-nirari, to be confused with the later Assyrian kings of the same name. He ruled a small kingdom surrounded by larger, hungrier rivals. His reign, from what little survives, seemed focused on consolidation, repairing canals, rebuilding shrines, importing goods from far-flung cities, and issuing decrees through a complex network of provincial governors and royal estates. One of those estates, based on the tablet we mentioned, was overseen by a woman. She is referred to only once in a single line of a single tabletin, a phrase that translates to a state of, the lady whose seal bears the crown of reeds. The crown of reeds. This was not decorative, it was symbolic. In Sumerian iconography, a crown of reeds or a bundle of reeds bound with ribbon, was often associated with queenship, not with being a wife, with ruling. Whoever she was not just a royal consort. She was a regent, a landholder, perhaps even a co-ruler, and then nothing. No more seals, no more receipts, no records of the estate passing to another woman. Only a few months later, another tablet from the same building refers to the property as held by the palace. The seal was scratched. The name was lost. Why? Some scholars speculate that she was involved in a dynastic dispute. Perhaps a rival queen from Mari or Eshnana was given temporary power during a treaty period, and when the alliance broke, so did her record. Others argue that she may have been local, possibly even a daughter of Comtes. Admirari granted temporary authority while the king traveled or fought. If she overstepped or simply fell out of favor, her legacy could have been deliberately erased. But this was not common in Mesopotamian practice. Even disgraced royals were often recorded. Their failures were catalogued. Their punishments listed. Erasure was rare, which is what makes this case so unsettling. Someone wanted her gone, not just in life, in memory. There's another clue. Years after Tel Arima declined, scholar copying older administrative texts in the city of Karana, modern Tel Arima's neighbor, noted an anomaly dot in a column listing royal wives. One entry had been replaced with a line of dots. This was not a mistake. It was deliberate redaction. The scribe, whose name has not survived, used a formula sometimes reserved for divine names that should not be spoken, or copied replacing them with placeholders. But this was not a god. This was a woman, one who had worn the crown of reeds. What do we make of this? Did she betray the kingdom? Did she die in scandal? Quote, was she a threat, not because of what she did, but because of what she represented? A woman in full possession of land, authority, and independent. Royal symbolism might have posed a risk to succession, or to male-centered control. So perhaps her erasure wasn't punishment, it was prevention. A warning to the scribes that followed: do not copy her name, do not speak it, do not remember. But the mud remembers. The seals remember. The tablets that survived the fire, the water, the long forgetting, they remember her absence, and in that absence begin to see her shape. Not in full, not clearly, but enough to know. She lived, that she ruled, and that someone feared what it meant for her to be remembered. You don't often think about what happens to clay when it's buried for thousands of years. Most people imagine it hardening into something solid, permanent, preserved. But not all clay does that, especially not the kind used for administrative tablets in Bronze Age Mesopotamia. If it wasn't baked intentionally, if it was merely dried in the sun, remained vulnerable. Water could melt it, heat could warp it, and time could erase everything, and yet some things remained. This is where the story gets slower, quieter. We leave the royal estate and step into the world of scribes, the palace bureaucracy, and their strange relationship with memory. You see, the disappearance of the woman behind the crown of reed seal wasn't an isolated event. Not completely. It fit into a pattern that repeated quietly across other cities of the Bronze Age, a pattern where powerful women who weren't simply wives or sisters of kings, but figures with independent titles, began to vanish from records during a particular stretch of centuries. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, systematically, and always from the margins first. Not the temples, not the royal decrees, but the ledgers, the tablets that tracked oil rations, grain deliveries, temple donations, canal repairs. These were the heartbeat of the city. They were supposed to be boring, neutral, yet even in this boring record-keeping, something began to shift. Names were omitted, titles were shortened, signatures blurred or erased. This wasn't just a local accident in Tel al-Rima. It was part of a larger transition in Mesopotamian political culture, one that favored centralization under kings, and often under kings alone. And when kings wanted to rewrite history, they didn't start with monuments. They started with mud. Imagine, for a moment, the tablet room where this process unfolded. It is small, dimly lit. The shelves are wooden cedar, if you were wealthy. Tamarisk, if you weren't. The tablets are stacked like bricks, each one marked with a date, a location, and a scribe's name. You can hear the scratch of a stylus as it presses, wedge after wedge, into damp clay. There is no ink, no pen. It's just a reed cut at an angle and the rhythm of silence between impressions. Here, in this dusty little room, memory was shaped. The scribes were not just clerks. They were trained professionals, literate in Sumerian and Akkadian, trained in mathematics, astronomy, and divination. Many were attached to temples. Some served the palace directly, and a select few were tasked with archiving, not just recording daily life, but preserving the past, copying older documents, reorganizing them, summarizing them for future use. And it was in these copying sessions that some names simply didn't survive, not because the scribes were careless, but because they were told not to include them, or perhaps told not to see them. One clay tablet from the city of Karana offers a quiet clue. It's a list, nothing more than a list of grain, allotments for a royal festival. Most names are men. One is a woman, but next to her name, instead of a title, there's a blank dot. It should have read Nin Edom, Queen of the Festival. Instead, it says nothing, no error marks, no corrections, just silence where a title should be. That silence isn't random. Across multiple sites, Stale, Leland, Mari, and even southern cities like Larsayu begin to see these quiet redactions show up between roughly 1800 BCE and 1600 BCE, a period of about 2 centuries. The same 2 centuries that saw the rise of centralized kingship in the old Babylonian period, where kings began styling themselves not just as shepherds of their cities, but as chosen agents of gods, their feminine titles, especially autonomous. Ones like Nin, Lady, Erez, High Priestess, or Zakanako, military governor, began to appear less frequently, even when the same woman continued to receive rations or sign for goods. Her role became harder to track. It's easy to miss, but the mud doesn't lie. Take the case of an estate known as Gal Nintur, the palace of the young queen. It appears in an older tablet from the city of Shubatenlo, one of the administrative centers of the kingdom of Akhenaten, roughly contemporary with Tel al-Rima. This palace is mentioned 3 times. First, it's a residence of a woman named Teramiram, who signs as daughter of the king. Second, as a site for religious offerings connected to the goddess Ishtar. And third, as simply property of the royal household. The woman is gone. The temple reference is dropped. The estate, once personal and sacred, becomes administrative. It has been flattened politically and symbolically, and no one scratches out her name. They simply stop using it. Let's return to Tel al-Rima. For a moment, among the thousands of fragments cataloged, there is a small, triangular seal, impression, probably from a storage jar or basket tag. The seal is hard to read, but one image is clear. A woman seated on a throne is holding a branch in one hand and a ring in the other. These were not random symbols. The branch was a sign of divine favor. The ring was a sign of justice or rulership. This was no servant, no consort, and yet her name is gone, erased from the edge of the seal. The wax, or clay, or bar tag to which it was once attached is long since decayed. All that remains is the triangle, the worn impression, the quiet. The seal doesn't scream of conspiracy. key doesn't shout rebellion, it whispers a woman's place, and to silence that followed. It is worth asking, why does this matter? If you've fallen asleep to this history, if your eyelids are already heavy, you might wonder why it's worth dwelling on someone who left no monuments, no tombs, no epics in their name. But perhaps that's the point, because history isn't just the story of what was built or carved in stone. It's the story of what was erased and who was made forgettable. This unnamed woman, this queen who may have ruled briefly, signed for land, administered grain, perhaps led prayers or managed temple offerings, was once remembered clearly enough to merit a seal, a title, a crown of reeds. Someone saw her as powerful, powerful enough to require removal. That's not a footnote. That's a signal. There is one final fragment we must consider. It comes from a different city much farther south and slightly later. But the connection is haunting. It is a school tablet, not a legal record, not a royal archive, just a simple clay tablet used by a student to practice writing Sumerian names. On one side, he copied male names from a list. On the other, began copying names of royal women, probably from an old hymn or temple chant. And then he stopped. The line cuts off halfway through the word nin. The rest of the tablet is blank. Scholars say it may have broken during use, or the student was interrupted, but some believe quietly that he was told not to copy that name, because even long after, the woman had disappeared from the records. A name might still have lived on someone's tongue, and that, it seems, was too dangerous. You are standing in a museum. Not one of the big ones. There is no marble, no polished glass. It's just a quiet room, underlit and quiet. A room that smells faintly of dust, old wood, and archival glue. It's the kind of place most visitors walk past without entering. Here, in the back gallery of an archaeological institute, you see it, a single clay tablet, cradled in foam, cracked but intact. The text, written in old Babylonian script, speaks of barley, donkeys, and temple deliveries. It is, at first glance, utterly boring, but then you notice the name scratched at the edge, faint, almost worn away. Written by a tired hand in the bottom margin, it is a woman's name. One not found in royal inscriptions or temple dedications. One that appears in only 3 known tablets. She is not labeled as queen, not even priestess, just a name. But it is the same name that appeared decades earlier on the crown of reed seal at Tel Al-Rimah. No one knows how the name survived. No one knows why it was used again, but it did. And this is how the queen lived, not in statues or grand legends, but in margins, in small slips of clay passed from hand to hand, buried in the refuse heaps of administrative life. So her memory survived not in monuments, but in the ephemera of the state, kind of bureaucratic haunting, and that, in the end, might be the most enduring kind of remembrance. It is time now to pull back from the woman herself, to look at the wider structures that made her forgettable. Not just in the personal sense, but in the historical one, because this wasn't just the story of a single woman. It was the story of a system that turned memory into privilege, and then made forgetting a tool of power. In the Bronze Age, memory was not permanent. It was clay, not stone. Clay that could be melted, crumbled, reshaped. Okay? If your name appeared in the king lists, the temple hymns, or the law codes, then you survived. If not, your survival depended on randomness. A broken seal, school tablet, a mishelped ledger. This woman's disappearance, then, was not a mystery in the usual sense. No cloak and dagger conspiracy. No dramatic downfall. It's just a quiet, structured omission. She was removed, not with fire, but with silence. Let us linger for a moment on what made her vulnerable to such forgetting. First, her title. we never recovered it fully. But clues suggest she may have served as a kind of temple administrator, perhaps a high-ranking erasures, a woman of divine standing, responsible for overseeing offerings, land holdings, and ritual duties. These roles were powerful, but not always tied to royal bloodlines, and they were often seen as interruptible in times of dynastic change. Second, her location, Tel al-Rima, was not Babylon. It was a provincial outpost, dusty administrative town, serving a greater kingdom. People who rose to prominence, they were always subject to revision by distant kings, especially women who acted autonomously, especially women whose power could not be neatly explained by lineage or marriage. And finally, her timing. She lived during a period of rising centralization, when kings across Mesopotamia began to emphasize divine kingship, asserting themselves as singular rulers rather than members of complex royal courts. In such regimes, ambiguity became dangerous. Female authority, particularly if not rooted in the king's household, became harder to justify. In other words, the very traits that once gave her power independence, local prestige, religious legitimacy, became liabilities in the new political order. This is not unique to her. Across the ancient Near East, women who once held significant public titles began to vanish from inscriptions during this period. Take the example of Enigaldina, a princess of Ur and a high priestess of the moon god. For centuries, the title she held was inherited by elite women across generations. They left temples, tablets, even teaching texts. But by the late second millennium BCE, this title all but disappeared. Not because the role ceased to exist, but because it was no longer celebrated in writing, or considered poibi. The queen buried in the royal cemetery of Ur. Her tomb was rich, her status unmistakable, but in written records, her name barely appears. It is only from her grave goods that we understand her importance. It's her memory, too, swallowed by the clan till excavators brushed it free 3,000 years later. These disappearances were not accidents, teased decisions made by scribes, priests, and kings who chose which names to repeat, which to allow to fade. And yet, in that forgetting, something strange happens. The silence becomes a kind of presence. You begin to notice the absences. You look at the long lists of royal names, and you ask, where are the women? You read the economic ledgers, and you wonder, who signed for the grain? Who actually managed the temple kitchens, the weaving houses, the canal schedules? Can you realize their absence is not proof of their non-existence? It is proof of their erasure, and that erasure was a kind of power, too, because it meant that they had been important enough to erase, not ignored, not never there, but deliberately forgotten. So, what do we make of the woman behind the seal? She left no tomb, no hymn, no law code bearing her judgment, and yet she remains in the faint edge of a seal, in a forgotten ledger, in the awkward silence where a title should have been, and in the careful patterns of omission that, once noticed, began to tell their own kind of history. A history written not in stone, but in the decisions of scribes. A history that survives not in memory, but in silence. The last surviving tablet that mentions her name was found not in a palace, but in a trash pit. It had been discarded, perhaps during a record clearing campaign, or perhaps it had simply outlived its usefulness, an old ledger, out of date. It was broken in half, and the top portion was missing, but the name was on the bottom, still readable, still hers, still waiting. And maybe that's what makes her story so haunting. Not that she disappeared, but that she didn't disappear completely. That history, no matter how carefully rewritten, still leaves fingerprints, and that sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones you have to excavate in silence. Now we leave her behind, the woman of the reed crown, the forgotten seal, the barely there name. Her story is not finished, but it is as full as the clay will allow. Her silence lingers, her absence speaks, and the mountain of history she was buried under begins to shift. You've heard of the Code of Hammurabi, haven't you? It's towering black basalt, steely carved with 282 laws from ancient Mesopotamia, each line etched so finely into the surface that it resembles dense embroidery more than law. It's usually displayed as a symbol of early justice, a monument to order in a chaotic world. And yet, like so many monuments, what's most interesting is not just what's written on it, but what was quietly left out. And in the dust between those lines, in the dark gaps of administrative stone, lies the story of a woman whose name is unknown, but whose legal influence at one point was so pronounced that later rulers decided it had to be removed entirely. She was never called queen, not by any surviving name, not in any recovered temple archive or funerary inscription. But she might have been something just as powerful and, perhaps, more threatening to the men who came after. She might have been a judge, or worse, a lawgiver. And, if you know anything about ancient history, you know this. It was one thing to be a wife, or a mother, or even a goddess, but to shape law, that was dangerous. So let's return, very slowly, to the law itself, to the long, strange code that has captured the imagination of scholars for centuries, and to the paragraph that once existed in its middle, and then vanished. Code of Hammurabi wasn't the only legal code of its time. There were others, older ones, the laws of Yarnamu, written over 300 years earlier, the laws of Ishnana, the so-called Sumerian family laws. Many of these earlier codes were written in Sumerian, the language of ritual and temple administration, while Hammurabi's stele was carved in Akkadian, the newer, more pragmatic tongue of empire and trade. But what unites these texts is their format: short, formulaic legal scenarios etched into clay or stone. If a man steals a goat, if a son strikes his father, if a woman leaves her husband, these laws were not statutes in the modern sense. They weren't about setting rules so much as documenting precedents, hypothetical cases, and their expected outcomes. And in the laws of Ishnana, strange clause appears. It's law number 2:1. It says, if a woman sits in judgment at the city gate, and then it stops. The tablet is broken there, but the very existence of the opening line is shocking. Not because it implies some act of rebellion, but because it implies normalcy. If a woman sits in judgment, he does not say she is forbidden to do so. It simply presents it as one possible condition, like stealing a cow or damaging a field. She could sit in judgment. She could be part of legal adjudication, and she was not described as a witch, or a goddess, or a deviant. She was described as a person, a citizen, a woman at the city gate where judgment happened. Now, let's compare this to Hammurabi. His code comes later, more organized, more hierarchical, more performative. While earlier codes were compiled by scribes, Hammurabi's was carved in stone and displayed publicly. Begins with the dramatic prologue, where the king proclaims himself chosen by the gods to bring justice to the land. And yet, throughout his nearly 300 laws, not once is a woman permitted to issue a legal judgment. Women appear, yes, as wives, prostitutes, temple servants, concubines, even traitors, but never as judges, and not just that certain female roles that existed in older laws are either absent or rewritten. Gone is the woman who sits in judgment. Gone is the clause that once allowed her to be heard. It is as though she was legally erased, not just from the court, but from the imagination of those who might follow. But what happened between Ishnana and Babylon to prompt that erasure? What made her so dangerous? You need to understand the legal culture of the time to answer that. In early Mesopotamian city-states, the line between law and religion was thin. Temples were not only centers of worship, they were administrative powerhouses. They owned land, managed grain, regulated marriage, and often enforced contracts. And many temple officials, particularly in Sumerian cities, were women. Women like Lipitishtar's daughter, Eninsunzi, who served as priestess judge in Isen. Women like Enheduanna, the high priestess of Yor, who combined ritual and political authority. Women whose inscriptions sometimes included legal titles, like Nagaram scribe or even DQ5 judge. These weren't fringe exceptions. They were part of an older tradition, but as kingdoms centralized, as warlords consolidated power into dynasties, the legal landscape shifted. Temples were brought under state control. Judgment moved from the city gate to the palace, and the female roles, those ambiguous, hybrid positions between ritual and civil authority, began to disappear. The silence wasn't sudden. You can trace it, tablet by tablet, in your temple. Women stopped being named as signatories on contracts in Lagash court. Records stopped listing female judges after a certain dynasty in Sippur. Economic tablets from the temple of Shamashta, god of justice, began to feature only male administrators, even though older tablets had many women managing grain and livestock. It's like watching someone dim the lights in a room slowly, so you don't realize it's dark until it's already happened. And then comes Hammurabi and his stone and his silence. But here's where the story becomes strange again, because in one copy of Hammurabi's Kodan, incomplete fragment found, not in Babylon, but in a provincial town called Nippur, there is a tiny scribal note in the margin. It is not a law, it is a correction, and it reads, line missing C, earlier draft. Line corresponds to a section in the stele where there is an unusually wide spacing between two clauses. And some scholars quietly, cautiously, have proposed that something was once carved there, something chiseled away. And if that is true, if a line was removed, what was it? No one can say for certain, but some believe it might have been a holdover from earlier laws, something like the Ishnana clause, something like, if a woman sits in judgment. And if that's true, then this isn't just a case of erasure, a case of revision, a rewriting of a law itself. Why does it matter? Because it changes how we understand history, not just the people who wrote it, but those who were written out. This was not an accident. It was a decision, and those decisions rippled through time by removing women from the legal code. Hammurabi and the scribes who followed him helped reshape the boundaries of authority for generations, not just in Babylonia, but in the cultures that looked to it as a model: Assyria, Persia, Rome. Even modern scholars, who for decades assumed that women never held public office in ancient Mesopotamia until fragmentary tablets began to challenge that idea. So we're left with this question: who was the woman at the gate? Who was the judge they erased? And what judgments did she pass that made her worth forgetting? You've now met the woman only hinted at in a broken clause. If a woman sits in judgment, and begun to understand how she was slowly written out of the record. But to know why that vanishing mattered, and how such authority was even possible in the first place, we need to turn our attention to the quiet heart of Mesopotamian civilization. Not the palace, not the army, but the temple. You see, if you were living in a city like Ur or Lagash during the early Bronze Age, roughly 2100 BC, the temple wasn't just a religious building, It was the administrative and economic core of your world. It issued food rations, measured land, trained scribes, managed labor forces, collected taxes in barley, and most curiously taught law. This was the setting in which women once held sway, not through thrones or crowns, but through balance, sheets, and clay tablets. Their tools weren't swords or seals of kingship. Their power came from cuneiform, and in that power, a quieter kind of authority emerged. A priestess in this world wasn't merely a caretaker of rituals. She was also a manager of contracts, a recorder of debt, and, at times, a witness to court proceedings. Her temple didn't Just store incense, stored legal precedent, and perhaps, if the broken laws are to be believed, some of these women even decided cases themselves. So, what did that life look like? Slow down and look more closely. It begins at the tablet house. Every major temple maintained a scribal school, often called the edible Tarali tablet house. Here boys were trained to become scribes. But in some cities, girls from elite families also attended. We know this because their names appear in practice exercises, small clay tablets listing repetitive signs, phrases, and even made-up contracts. One girl named Nanala left behind dozens of such exercises. Another, named Gmspn, practiced tax formulas and legal clauses. They were not anomalies. They were the daughters of merchants, of priests, of former kings, and they were learning law, not in the abstract sense, but through highly repetitive, practical training. Day after day, they would press their reed styluses into wet clay, copying the phrase, "If a man strikes another man and blinds him, he shall pay 1 mina of silver." Or, if a woman repudiates her husband. Over time, these students advanced to more complex documents, wills, inheritance contracts, land deeds, and when they graduated, some became Nijik temple administrators, others became Sagbar scribes attached to priestesses, and a few, just a few, recorded with the title Dubasar D-Ku5-Scribe-Judge. It is here we find our clues. One such woman was Inatoma. She lived around 2050 BCE in the city of Nippur, and she served as high priestess of the temple of Enlil. Her sealed inscription is still preserved. It doesn't say queen, it doesn't say wife. It says Inatuma, daughter of the king, priestess of Enlil, judge of the temple gate. She had the authority to settle disputes brought before the temple. Her rulings were recorded on clay and her seal impressed upon them. Another was Baron Tara, a priestess of Lagash, who issued rations, signed grain ledgers, and supervised canal maintenance, sententially managing city infrastructure. When farmers brought disputes over irrigation rights, they brought them to her. Still another, unnamed, appears in a document from the city of Sippar, where a list of officials includes one woman marked as DQ5. The context suggests she oversaw labor disputes among temple workers, especially the female beer brewers and weavers. These women didn't wear crowns. They didn't make proclamations from balconies. They sat on low platforms beneath palm roofs, surrounded by scribes and baskets of tablets. They listened, they judged, they wrote, and the city moved accordingly. But why then were they erased? Why did this quiet legal power fade from memory? The answer lies in a slow political realignment that began in the late 2nd millennium BCE, when the balance between temple and palace tilted decisively toward kingship. As dynasties grew more powerful, they began to centralize legal authority. No longer would temples adjudicate contracts or disputes independently. No longer would priestesses have the final say in matters of inheritance or property lines. Laws had to come from the king and the king alone. Even when kings honored old gods, they increasingly bypassed the temple hierarchy, creating royal courts with their own judges, scribes, and bureaucrats. And those judges, almost universally male. By the time Hammurabi came to power around 1792 BCE, this trend was well underway. He didn't invent it, he perfected it. His legal code is remarkable not just for its content, but for its control. By codifying every aspect of civil and criminal life under his name, he effectively replaced local variation with royal doctrine. Justice no longer flowed from the gods through their priestesses. It now flowed from the king, and that meant the temple judges, especially the women, became politically irrelevant. In fact, some scholars argued that Hammurabi's famous prologue is not merely a statement of piety, but a political warning. It says, "I, Hammurabi, the shepherd chosen by the gods, have caused justice to prevail in the land. It does not say, we, the judges of the city. It does not say, the priestesses, have spoken. It is a declaration of monopoly. One source of law, one voice, and that voice is male. Still, its traces remain in the archives of Mari, a city on the middle Euphrates. A set of letters survives between King Zimrilim and his daughters. One of them, Inekshari, asks her father for the right to oversee certain legal cases in the temple. Another asks to be allowed to sit at the gate, as in the time of the mothers. The phrase is haunting, as in the time of the mothers. It suggests a memory of female judgmental role, now reduced to nostalgic metaphor, and yet also preserves a truth the royal records tried to bury, that there was a time not of queens, but of legal matriarchs, a time of mothers who judged. The erasure didn't happen with a single chisel. It happened with policy, with standardization, with the writing of new codes that excluded old possibilities, but the fragments remain scattered in practice tablets, in forgotten seal inscriptions, in letters from daughters to distant kings, and together they suggest that law in the ancient world was not always what it later became. It was not always male, not always royal. Sometimes it was whispered in the language of barley counts and boundary stones. Sometimes it was spoken by a woman at the city gate. So we are left with a question that history never answered. If a woman sits in judgment, does she say? And why did so many kings never want us to hear it, to hear it? Let's return once more to the quiet woman behind a broken closet. A woman sits in judgment. Not a queen, not a warrior, not a mythic figure, but someone real, seated under the shaded lintel of a temple gate. She knew the laws, not just by their clauses, but by the rhythm of how they were recited. Not just the ink of the clay, but the arguments that came before and after. She was one of many one name among a chorus of priestesses and administrators who once knew the law not as commandment, but as conversation. And yet, sometime between the age of tablets and the rise of empire, her chair at the gate was taken away. Her voice, once matter-of-fact and clerical, was recast as silence. Not violently, not with destruction, but with administrative indifference. The transition wasn't a thunderclap. It was the quiet shifting of daily practices, grain tallies, moved from temple archives to palace officials. Local contracts began requiring royal witnesses. Minor disputes, once settled in temple courtyards by scribes like her, began to be heard by magistrates, appointed directly by the king. You can see the change in the handwriting. Earlier temple contracts ones from Lagash, Uruk, Nippur were written in elegant, curling cuneiform by trained temple scribes. The later ones from royal courts shift in style, blockier, more formal, less fluid. Ain't the language becomes stiffer too. It's packed with royal phrases, according to the law of the king, rather than according to custom. The laws didn't necessarily change overnight, but who could speak the man who could interpret them dead? That's how erasure works. It doesn't always rewrite history. Sometimes it just stops letting certain people read it. But if you were to dig through the cracked, sun-baked tablets of those older erasures, especially the administrative piles of temple storehouses, so find the trails of those women still embedded in the clay. There's Ninkala, a temple scribe who approved fish rations and witnessed an unusual land exchange between two brothers in the city of Gersu. There's Absunu, recorded in a receipt for wool measuring over 600 minas. She signed off on the final count, suggesting a role not just in economics, but verification, a crucial piece of law. There's Inanatama, as we mentioned earlier, who judged labor disputes. She left behind more than 30 receipts, including one involving a boundary dispute between two barley farmers. Her ruling that the boundary stone should remain unmoved, as it had been since the days of their father. And then there are the unknown ones, a clay fragment from the city of Isenburnt, in an old warehouse fire contains the start of a legal oath by the goddess Nisaba, scribe of the gods. Let this be sealed. The clause was never finished. The tablet was never fired, but the presence of the goddess Nisaba, patron of scribes and learning, suggests that women once invoked a divine authority for legal decisions, at least in sacred spaces. Nisaba herself was female, and in a time when the divine and bureaucratic were tangled together. That matters. So what changed? It was not just kingship, it was conquest. As larger empires absorbed the smaller city-states of Mesopotamia, they brought with them more centralized administration. The Assyrians, in particular, expanded royal bureaucracy, demanding uniformity across cities, and moving judicial authority further away from temples and into palatial control. Royal law became imperial law. Priestesses, especially those in charge of economic and legal matters, began to vanish from the records, not because they had all died out, but because they no longer fit the format. And format in an archival civilization is everything. When scribes began drafting law codes as display monuments rather than working documents, when law was carved in basalt rather than etched into everyday tablets, the voices of quiet legal practice were excluded. After all, display monument has no room for nuance. It doesn't leave space for the priestess at the gate, or the barley loan with 5 years delay, or the weaver's complaint about shortened cloth rations. Those only appear in the ledger tablets, and when the ledgers are no longer copied, people disappear. Yet there were echoes. Always echoes in the Hittite archives. Far to the north, one law reads, if a woman judge is appointed, means she errs in her verdict, she shall pay double. This law is not flattering, but it proves something important, that the concept of a female judge was still imaginable even if increasingly frowned upon. Elsewhere, in Egypt, a woman named Nebat served as vizier, effectively the highest legal authority under the pharaoh during the 6th dynasty. Her name was inscribed with honors. But by the time of the New Kingdom, such roles were closed to women. Even Nebat became a curiosity rather than a precedent in Rome. Centuries later, the 12 tables explicitly barred women from speaking in courtrooms in their own defense, a direct reversal from a world in which they once heard and decided cases, even in biblical Israel, where male prophets and judges dominate the text. One woman, Deborah, is described as judging under the palm tree, a faint echo of the woman at the gate. She is an exception, but exceptions point to forgotten norms. So, what does all this mean? It means that the disappearance of the female judge wasn't a sudden prohibition. It was a long disqualification, not enforced by sword, but by systems, by scribal habits, administrative centralization, standardization of legal language, and a shift in political theology that equated justice with kingship. It means that the erasure was procedural, and that makes it all the more effective. What's most striking, perhaps, is that no law ever explicitly banned women from judging. There is no clause that says a woman may not sit at the gate. Instead, her name was simply no longer recorded. Her seal was no longer pressed into contracts. Her voice was no longer cited as precedent. But erasure, when it's quiet, has a way of preserving the shape of what it removed. A pause in a clause, a blank in a register, a sentence that begins if a woman sits in judgment, and then ends mid-thought. Those silences are records too. They're just harder to read in the modern age. Those silences began to speak again. Archaeologists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, digging through temple ruins and palace archives, covered thousands of cuneiform tablets, many administrative, many never meant to be kept beyond a year or two. And it was in those boring, bureaucratic texts that women re-emerged, not as queens or temptresses or priestesses in myth, but as scribes, witnesses, lenders, and yes, judges. 1957 excavation unearthed a tablet containing a debt contract for sesame seed overseen by a woman named Amarzin. She had no title, but her seal was used to validate the agreement. She, not a male relative, held the authority that another, found in Nipper, listed a grain warehouse overseer female and responsible for calculating losses during a flood. These are not grand stories. They are ledger entries, but they tell us something no epic poem can. That, for a time, in a thin ribbon of years between the collapse of city kings and the rise of empires, women sat with styluses and judgment and wrote the law not on pillars, but in the small, squared tablets of daily life. And then they stopped. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, you might imagine one of them not a famous figure, not a queen, but a woman seated at the city gate. She hears a complaint about a barley loan. She asks the parties to speak plainly. She consults a tablet of precedent from 2 generations ago, stored in the temple archive. She considers the custom, the season, the fairness of it all, and then she speaks, not with ceremony, not with drama, just with the quiet clarity of someone who knows how grain moves and how debts grow. Someone who knows how to keep a city balanced, and though her words were never carved in stone, they lasted longer than most laws, until they didn't. There are cities whose names slip off the tongues of textbooks and reappear only in the whisper of archaeological reports. Kadesh, as it sometimes appears, was one of those cities. Once poised on the banks of the Orontes River in what is now western Syria, it was a fortress, a hub, and briefly, a linchpin in the balance of ancient powers. Its rise was not meteoric, nor was its fall cataclysmic. Instead, like so many stories in the Near East, it was a city swallowed by shifting alliances, broken treaties, and the river's slow erosion of memory. But the story here isn't just about Kadesh. It's about the queen who ruled within its fortified walls, a woman whose name does not survive in any monument, whose face is not painted on any temple relief, but who once signed treaties, dispensed grain, and presided over the narrow courts carved into limestone. Her existence is presumed, hinted at in the titles of male envoys, and flickering in the footnotes of treaties between empires. A queen without a name, a throne without a memorial. A disappearance not caused by violence, but by the clerical drift of empire. So let's start in the early 13th century BC, around the time when Kadesh stood at the crossroads of empire. At this point in history, Egypt was a vast, reaching hand under the pharaoh Ramesses II. The Hittite Empire, based in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, had extended its fingers into northern Syria, and the city of Kadesh sat awkwardly between these 2 grasping powers. It was not neutral, no city could be, but it was adaptable. Its rulers had learned to nod diplomatically in both directions, making deals with whoever had more chariots at their gates. In those years, Kadesh was known for 3 things: its high, fortified mound, its reputation as a grain hub in the upper Orontes Valley, and the peculiar independence of its palace. The city was ruled by what Egyptian and Hittite sources referred to as a household, suggesting a ruling family or dynasty that was somewhat distinct from the directly controlled governance typical of other provincial cities. And more curiously, references occasionally specified the title Mistress of Kadesh. This was not a typical priestess title, nor was it symbolic. In 2 surviving fragments, 1 Hittite and 1 Egyptian, the mistress is mentioned in conjunction with the trade agreements and diplomatic correspondence. The exact names are missing, scraped, or shattered, or never recorded, but the technical completion is that the ruler of Kadesh was a woman, not just ceremonially, not just spiritually, but politically. She held authority at a time when even mighty Egypt permitted only royal women the power of birth, not governance. How could this be? To understand, You need to know what Kadesh was not. It was not a capital. It had no great ziggurat like those of Babylon, no sprawling palace like that of Hattusa. Instead, Kadesh's heart was its citadella, tight cluster of buildings on a raised mound surrounded by thick stone walls. The streets were narrow, curved to follow the contours of the hill, and most of the houses were made of mud brick with wooden beams. Markets spread outward like wings, with clusters of awnings offering grain, dried fish, leather, and goat cheese. The Orontes flowed lazily nearby, offering both irrigation and trade, though less consistently than the Tigris or Euphrates. Within this compact urban frame, a palace stood, not grand, not columned, but solid, made of stone and plastered mud brick, with rooms for storage, administration, and a large courtyard shaded by linen, canopis. It was here, according to an Egyptian merchant's travel ledger, that a woman with silver pins in her hair approved grain allocations during a time of scarcity. She's not named. No one is in the document, but she's described as mistress of the house of Kadesh, and more notably, ruler in the time of summer hunger. That phrase was not poetic, it was administrative. It indicates authority during a crisis, a moment when real leadership was exercised, and yet, despite this, we know almost nothing else about her. Why? Because her city became famous for something else in 1274 BCE. The Battle of Kadesh, one of the most famously recorded battles of the ancient world, took place near the city. Ramesses II of Egypt faced off against Muwatalli II of the Hittites in what was essentially a stalemate. Chariots thundered across the plains. Royal scribes recorded heroic speeches. Kadesh became a backdrop, no longer a city with a personality, but a location on a map, a stage for empires. After this, Kadesh's name appears mostly in reference to the battle. The Treaty of Kadesh is carved in hieroglyphs in Egyptian temples. One of the earliest surviving examples of a formal peace treaty. The treaty text includes names of kings, gods, envoys, but not of the locals who facilitated the negotiations, translated the terms, or prepared the grounds for both camps. The queen is gone, or perhaps more accurately, she was never carved in to begin with, because while empires recorded battles and treaties, they rarely preserved the routines of provincial life, especially when those routines included female leadership. The scribes of Hattusa in Memphis preferred to record kings and generals, not grain disputes or ration planning. And yet, there are tantalizing hints. A cylinder sill, found in 1929 in the lower strata of Khadijah's mound, bears the image of a seated figure, clearly female, holding a sheaf of grain in one hand and a stylus in the other. The seal is cracked. The inscription is partially worn, but the name begins with what could be transcribed as Elu, perhaps Eludum, or Elukara. The last symbol may represent of Kadesh. If this interpretation is correct, and that's a cautious ephit, would suggest not only a named queen, but one associated with both agriculture and record keeping, an administrator, a manager, a ruler, not by conquest, but by competence. The fact that her name was not copied into Hittite or Egyptian texts would not be surprising. She was not their queen. She was a local authority, a woman whose relevance ended where empire began. And yet, her absence is telling, especially when combined with the disappearance of Kadesh itself, because not long after the treaty, Kadesh vanishes from the major records. By 1200 BCE, the city was no longer a player in regional politics. Its buildings were crumbling, its markets moved north, and its people, those who didn't starve or flee, simply faded into the rolling hills. The Orontes shifted course slightly, trade routes moved west, and the memory of the queen, already faint, became dust. Was she buried in Kadesh? Perhaps, but no royal tombs have been found. Did she survive the wars? Did she flee? Was she exiled by a successor regime? or replaced by a more cooperative male governor? We don't know, but we do know. Her disappearance, coincided with the transformation of the region from localized authority to imperial frontier. And in that transformation, women like her administrators, scribes, caretakers of cities were written out of the political vocabulary. She wasn't erased violently. She was simply not copied. And so we ask, what happens to history when the scribes change their priorities, when stories are retold from the perspective of empires, battles, and kings? When everyday authorities, especially feminine authorities, rendered as background. That is the mystery of Kadesh, not why it fell, but why the woman who once ruled its streets was never remembered by name. Let's return to Kadesh, not the battlefield, not the map location between Egypt and the Hittites, but the city as it would have appeared just before the dust settled. Picture it, not in stone or glory, but in erosion and repetition. Walk through gates patched with newer bricks layered over old ones. The base would be limestone, but the walls, quilt of centuries mud brick, repaired with haste. Lime plaster, painted over by 3 different regimes. And inside that, you'd see a city built more for continuity than glory, because this was a city that had survived by becoming what others needed it to be. It had once answered to Mitanni overlords, then Hittite envoys, then Egyptian generals. The city didn't have to win battles. It just had to remain useful. And perhaps that is where the queen's authority truly came from. Because in cities that survive by diplomacy, the rulers must be skilled in managing people, not swords. In grain rations, not war horses. And that kind of power, soft and administrative, rarely leaves visible scars in the stone, but it lingers in the records if you know where to look. Kadesh sat in a strategic basin, but more importantly, it was a place where several cultures intersected: Amorite, Hittite, Egyptian, and Hurrian. It wasn't a capital of one people, but a meeting place of many. Kana's cultural diversity is why some archaeologists believe a woman could have ruled there in the first place. In Hurrian culture, for example, women often held religious and economic roles that could resemble power even if it wasn't labeled as kingship. Across the Near East, during the Bronze Age, the title of queen wasn't uniform. A woman might be called a sekenu in one region, a legal overseer, or a nin in another, meaning lady or priestess. In Hurrian territories, Tupsarza referred to female scribes, sometimes given authority over temple or palace accounts. In Kadesh, titles may have blended, creating roles that modern historians still struggle to define. So, it's possible, likely, even that the woman known to us only as the mistress of Kadesh was not an anomaly, but simply part of a larger administrative class, a bureaucrat, a dignitary, someone whose power was tied to her ability to negotiate rations, force treaties, and write reports, not to lead armies. In the quiet of daily life, such women governed thousands of people. They distributed land. They oversaw market exchanges. They held temples and tax offices together with columns of inventory lists. These roles didn't inspire epic poetry or royal steels, but they made cities livable. They made peace sustainable. But something changed in the final decades of Kadesh's documented life. It began slowly, as most disappearances do. Fewer mentions of the city's local rulers, and more references to Hittite-appointed envoys than Egyptian letters, speaking not of Kadesh as a partner, but as a territory to be retaken. By the time Ramesses III came to power in Egypt, Kadesh was rarely referenced at all. And in the wake of this erasure, a different kind of memory took hold, not of the woman who ruled, but of the men who fought over her city. The Battle of Kadesh, as it would later be stylized, became a lesson in propaganda. Ramesses II's temple walls declared it a triumph even, though he failed to capture the city. Titus recorded it as a strategic success. Titus' side mentioned the city's population. Neither acknowledged that for decades prior, Kadesh had been a functioning administrative hub run by locals, likely including women. Instead, the city became a symbol, and once a place becomes a symbol, its people become invisible. Let's look at what happens when a ruler is remembered without a name, because that's what we have in Kadesh. Fragments of a woman's governance, but none of her identity. No funerary inscription, no official tablet of succession, no statue, no mural, no cylinder, seal with a name fully intact. Instead, we rely on implications in a Hittite treaty preserved in fragments. There's a passage that refers to the former household of the city agreeing to grain standards set by the woman of the city. Another fragment, this time from an Egyptian trade manifest, notes that during a border negotiation, the lady of Kadesh received the gifts in the presence of the envoy. Not a name, just a lady. But how often in history have titles outlived the people behind them? Even in empires like Egypt or royal, women like Nefertari and Hatshepsut gained prominence. There were dozens of queens whose names are lost. Many were labeled simply as king's wife or mistress of the two lands' positions of immense influence, yet treated in records as interchangeable. In Kadesh, the lack of a name may not be an oversight. It may be the result of administrative practice. If Egyptian scribes didn't consider her a formal ruler, they wouldn't record her with the honorifics that preserve memory. And Hittite scribes, focused on treaties and tributaries, may have categorized her as a local intermediary, not worthy of royal protocol. This means her name may have existed in hundreds of transactions and grain receipts that were never preserved, written on perishable papyrus or wooden boards, lost in the fire that likely consumed the city centuries later. And yet, here's what remains. Traces in a room identified as an archive within the ruins of Kadesh. Archaeologists found a few surviving clay tablets. Among them, a list of grain stores, an agreement regarding the repair of city walls, and a fragment of what appears to be a palace inventory. On one of the tablets, a single line reads, "In the 5th year of the household's winter, the lady instructed the grain vault be sealed until the crescent passed." The household's winter likely refers to the 5th year of a particular ruler's reign, or perhaps a year of unusual hardship. And the lady may be our ruler, the one who knew that to keep a city alive during famine, he sometimes had to lock away for divan when people begged. This small decision, written not in the language of heroism, but in terms of storage management, may have been one of many that kept Kadesh functioning long after its more flamboyant neighbors fell. Fall of Kadesh was never dramatized. No epic poem was written about its destruction. No kingdom proclaimed it a conquest. Simply ceased being mentioned. The land was absorbed by successive empires, the Arameans, then the Assyrians, then the Persians. By the time of Alexander the Great, Kadesh was nothing more than an old mound on the route between Damascus and Tyre. But the memory of female rule didn't vanish entirely. 1,000 miles away, in a Hittite city called Erana, another ruler queen, Puduwapa, would rise to power. She signed treaties. She corresponded with Ramesses II directly. She spoke of law, justice, and divine favor. And though she was never associated with Kadesh, her existence proves that women in the late Bronze Age could be sovereigns, not just in title, but in practice. So perhaps Kadesh's queen was part of a broader, now lost network of powerful women regional administrators, chiestesses, governors whose names vanished not because they lacked power, but because the record keepers didn't consider them part of history. They were part of life, and history is often a thing written afterward by outsiders. There is one final clue, or perhaps one last mystery, in a late Greek geographer's writings, centuries after Kadesh was gonna he mentions a place in Syria, once ruled by a noblewoman whose name is now lost, but whose tomb the locals still avoid. The site, he notes, was called Kadasa, and the stone structure long crumbled. was believed to house a ruler who died of grief after watching her city taken by strangers. This could be a myth, or it could be a distorted echo of something real, a memory passed down not through tablets or inscriptions, but through habit-sold names, sacred stones, whispered warnings. And in that possibility, we find something powerful, that, even when history forgets, people sometimes remember, not the name, but the presence, not the ruler, but the rules she once set. The final section of our journey takes us not to a grand tomb or battlefield, but to the slow collapse of a city already accustomed to fading into the background. Kadesh, once the meeting ground of empires, the place where treaties were signed, and silence maintained peace, did not go out in flames or trumpet sound. It disappeared the way all practical things disappear by no longer being needed, and for its ruler, the unnamed queen, the one we have followed through dusty palace ledgers and temple inventories. This is perhaps the only fitting ending, not a dramatic downfall, but a gradual erosion, a burial, not beneath dirt, but beneath newer priorities. Let's step back into that city one more time, not as tourists, not as historians, but as residents. The smell of tannins from dye pots curling into alleyways, piles of barley sacks stacked behind guarded thresholds. At mid-morning, the clinking of clay bowls as scribes in the administrative quarters settle in for another long day of recording shipments, labor rosters, and requests for masonry. The palace isn't golden, it's lime-washed plaster. The air is dry. Pigeons coo beneath the flat rooftop beams. In the wind carries dust through the corridors, where the queen once sat, not on a throne, but at a low wooden table, reviewing numbers, because, even in its final decades, the palace remained an office more than a royal court, and she, it seems, remained an administrator. Her legacy, if one were to trace it, is written in the way things still functioned long after the wars ended. In cities like Kadesh, continuity was the greatest achievement. Not war, not conquest. The fact that water flowed and the bread ovens stayed warm, that people didn't starve at some point. Likely in the early 12th century BC, earcords stop. Archaeologists date this to the period just after the so-called Bronze Age collapse. Term, neat and final in textbooks, hides the reality. Collapse was rarely instant. It took years, sometimes decades, came in layers. The first layer was political. Trade routes shifted. Grain, no longer flowed in from Egyptian storehouses. Hittite demands stopped arriving. Foreign embassies ceased to send messengers. This was not liberation. It was isolation. Then came economic erosion. Without foreign subsidy, Kadesh had to rely solely on local agriculture. It wasn't enough. Fields were dry. The Orontes River, generous in good years, became erratic. Drought followed flood, and without outside grain, reserves shrank. Inventory tablets from this period show shorter rations. Fewer goats registered per household. Temples began to record offerings in fractions of their previous amounts. But the palace, Qaeda, the one overseen by the same lineage of scribes who'd worked under the unnamed lady, kept going until it, one of the last intact tablets, found in the site's lowest administrative levels, bears a date written in an lost format. Scholars estimate it was made during the final years of the city's function. It's not a grand proclamation. It's a delivery log. It lists 12 jars of wheat from the upper terrace, 6 amphorae, free to burden from temple reserves, 3 sealed pouches of dried lentils, 1 directive, to be stored until next moon after equinox. Do not distribute without house seal. That final line, like so many before it, ends in an unnamed authority. House seal. It's possible, maybe even likely, that the Queen's household, or its successors, still issued orders, even as everything else crumbled. that they still functioned not in power, but in service, that, even in ruin, they maintained a system of balance. And it's here we find the queen again, not in a statue, but in the idea of oversight. The question arises, how could a city with such intricate governance, such well-documented balance, simply but disappear? It's a fair question, but the answer, like most truths in ancient history, lies not in catastrophe, but in accumulation. In this case, the accumulation of pressures, economic, environmental, political, logistical. There is no record of Kadesh being sacked in these years, no burnt layers consistent with war, no mass graves. Instead, what archaeologists find is abandonment, rooms with clay tablets left in place, unbroken, food storage emptied but not looted, doors left open. It seems that the people of Kadesh, those who remained when the last trade envoy departed, simply ran out of reasons to stay, and so they left, perhaps in groups, perhaps family by family, south to the valleys, north to Aleppo, or inland toward the Euphrates. Some took what they could carry, others left behind more than belongings. They left the city's memory, its structure, its governance, its delicate logic to dissolve. And in this way, the legacy of its final ruler, the unnamed woman of Kadesh, faded, not because she was forgotten, but because the system she maintained outlived her need. And when the city no longer needed governance, when it could no longer support trade or temples or archives, she ceased to be remembered, not with malice, but with silence. But silence does not always mean insignificance. It's worth pausing here, just briefly, to consider what it means to lead when the world isn't watching, to rule without inscription, to preserve order when no one is writing your name in stone. This is the story of the Queen of Kadesh, the administrator, the house seal, Atiya, the one who sealed the vaults during famine and redirected grain during drought, the one whose only legacy may be a few delivery logs and an absence where her name should have been. In many ways, her legacy is more common than we admit. History is full of unnamed figures who upheld systems until the very last moment, especially women, especially in roles considered secondary or domestic. Yet, without them, cities would not have functioned. Roads would not have been repaired. Markets would not have run. The Queen of Kadesh may have been one of these figures, crucial, UNCLEBRATED, gone without a trace, as centuries passed. The city turned to dust. Later villages were built on its edges, then forgotten again. Today, the mound, where Kadesh once stood, is little more than a series of grassy rises and excavation trenches. The administrative quarter, the one that housed the grain logs and the tablets, now lies beneath a parking lot used by archaeologists. The past, in many cases, is buried, not under cataclysm, but convenience. But if you stand on that hill just before sunset, you might see the contours of something quiet, the suggestion of a wall, a path long since flattened, a chamber where someone once made decisions that kept hundreds alive, and somewhere beneath it all, maybe the memory of a ruler, not in a grand inscription, but in the shape of the choices she left behind. At first glance, the ruins of Alalak seem unspectacular, a series of sun-bleached trenches and mud brick walls in what is now modern-day Turkey. The city once lay along the bend of the Orontes River, somewhere between the Hittite mountains and the edge of Egyptian influence. The excavated fragments tell stories, but slowly, cautiously, mud brick is fragile, and time erases confidence. Yet, within this unremarkable ruin, archaeologists uncovered one of the most peculiar silences in Bronze Age history, a sudden and total erasure of a queen's name. Her face was scratched off every seal, her titles were broken mid-clay, and in the palace archives so methodical, so complete, her records stopped abruptly. She vanished, not into legend, but into bureaucracy. Let's start not with the mystery, but with the routine. With the world this queen would awoken into each day. It is morning in a lilac. The air is warm, the kind of stillness that settles just before the heat arrives. Keys in the palace kitchens. Firewood crackles beneath clay ovens. A cook is grinding barley with a stone roller, preparing for a batch of flatbreads. Scribes begin their work near the archive hall, laying out damp clay tablets on wooden boards, copying shipment records from the previous day. How many goats from the northern valley? How many jars of wine from the coast? It's a kingdom of ledges, not legends. Every pot accounted for, and somewhere deeper in the palace, a woman prepares herself, not for display, but for management. This woman, whose name we do not know with certainty, held the highest female title in the kingdom. Some surviving seals call her Nin, meaning lady in Sumerian, used broadly across Mesopotamian-influenced courts. Others refer to her as Dam, meaning wife, but not just any wife. The seal impressions suggest this was the chief wife of the king of Alak, the queen consort, perhaps even a co-regent. She had a chamber of her own seals, her own scribes. Some tablets show her issuing orders, independent of her husband. She had power. And then silence. Archaeologists working at Tel Chanaware, ancient Alalak, once have found the palace archive in two main phases. The earlier one, built during the reign of King Jeriamlum, included a robust system of taxation records, marriage contracts, land grants, and diplomatic letters. Within these, this unnamed queen appears multiple times, not always directly. Sometimes, in passing, she approved the dowry by order of the lady, stored in sealed jars. Or simply a seal, a small impression showing a figure in profile, arm raised, with a signature line that once bore her name. But in the later layer of the archive built atop the older one, her name is gone. Literally, clay tablets that once bore her seal had it scratched out. Others had a different woman's name written over hers, likely a later queen. More mysteriously, the ledgers of marriages and dowries no longer reference her court. She had become a ghost in her own home, not merely absent, but deliberately removed. And the question, whispered among archaeologists for decades, remains, why? In the Bronze Age Near East, names were not just identifiers, they were power. To inscribe your name into clay was to leave a legal trace. To have your seal on a tablet was to claim authority. Erasing a name, then, wasn't just vandalism, it was erasure of existence. This queen, whoever she was, had her name removed from the bureaucracy. But her impact lingered in the way officials hesitated to replace the ledgers. In the strange gaps in the court calendar, in the broken seals that remained in rooms later reused and never fully reorganized. Some scholars propose a coup, others point to a religious scandal. Still others wonder if her disappearance coincided with external conflict with the Hittite or Mitanni incursions that occasionally appended smaller kingdoms like Ulalak. But perhaps the most plausible theory is not that she was punished for failure, but that she became politically inconvenient. Let's return briefly to the role of Queenship in Alalak. In many Levantan city-states, marriage was a political tool. Queens were often foreign-born gifts of alliance or tribute. The balance of power shifted, so too did the value of that queen. Her family lost influence in a neighboring kingdom. Her position at court might become a liability. Her children, once heirs, could become threats. And so, some queens were erased, not out of hatred, but out of necessity, to preserve the Tictine Tart earring, to preserve the dynasty. To reset alliances, to prepare for remarriage. But this does not explain the thoroughness of the erasu. In one set of rooms beneath the main archive chamber, a collapsed storeroom held over 100 damaged tablets. Among them, a cluster of legal documents written by a female handwriter in the period. Experts believe they were written by a palace official from the Queen's court. The handwriting shifts midway through the collection. The new hand writes with less confidence, and the subject matter changes from dowries and temple donations to land seizures and grain confiscation. It's as if, after the Queen disappeared, her court dissolved into a scramble for control. No announcements were made. No funerary texts survive. And still, the city continued. The palace did not fall. The scribes kept working, but they no longer wrote about her. The woman with seals, the woman with power, gone, and yet, fragments remain. In the corner of the Queen's presumed quarters, archaeologists found a clay seal, mold used for impressing a ring seal into tablets. The mold shows a figure seated beneath a palm frond, surrounded by symbols of grain and water. On the reverse side, traces of a name remain. Not enough to read clearly, but enough to suggest her presence once mattered enough to mark things permanently. Nearby, a mere fragment bronze, warped with age, lay in a storage jar, wrapped in woven linen. Perhaps it was part of her daily ritual. Perhaps it was placed there after she was gone, hidden by someone who remembered. A servant, a scribe, a daughter. We'll never know. But someone didn't forget her entirely. The silence that followed is almost louder than any inscription, because it is in this quiet that we begin to feel the strange weight of bureaucratic erasure. This queen was not removed with a sword. She was not buried with curses or fire. She was removed by absence, her name rubbed out from ledgers, her deeds replaced by other hands, her seal recast with different figures. And yet, the systems she helped build of record-keeping, compelled donation, and legal arbitration remained for decades. The machine of the palace kept running. Without her, one last detail among the ruins, a single tablet fragment found in a drainage channel bears a line of text that stands apart from all others. It was not written by a scribe. Its clay is rough, sun-dried, not kill-baked. It was probably never meant for storage. It's just a note, a private message. A line from someone who worked within the palace and carried something unsaid. It reads, "Lady gave her ring back and did not speak." They closed the doors behind her. No name, no location, but context implies it refers to her, the woman. Its name would be removed. It's a small act of memory, a moment someone felt the need to record, even on unofficial clay. And perhaps it's all we'll ever have. Why do some people vanish from history while others are preserved? Is it a matter of fame or survival? Is it politics or luck? Or do we simply preserve the names that serve the stories we want to tell? In the case of the unnamed Queen of Alalik, her disappearance tells us more than her reign. It reminds us that history is not what happened, but what was written down. And that silence, too, is a form of story. A soft one, etched in dust, waiting to be remembered. The ruins of ancient Alalak rest quietly beneath the Turkish sun, not far from the banks of the Orontes. From the sky, it looks like a battered spiral, a mound of earth built up by centuries of rebuilding. Fire and abandonment, layers, or strata are not just dirt. They are the remains of every hand that ever touched the walls of that city, from farmers and masons to queens, who were never meant to be forgotten. But forgetfulness in the Bronze Age wasn't always an accident. Sometimes it was policy. Sometimes silence was the best way to smooth a dangerous memory. As the excavation of Telechana continued into the 20th and 21st centuries, archaeologists grew more confident in one thing. Someone in the palace made a choice. The queen was erased deliberately. The question that lingered, soft and maddening, was why. This section explores that question, not through her, but through those left behind. The scribes, the servants, the laws, the rooms she once moved through, still filled with the dust of daily life. A palace is not a person, it's a system. And systems, even after a purge, tend to leave marks. Let's walk slowly through them in the palace archives of Alalik. There are hundreds of clay tablets, some no larger than a child's hand, others the size of a hardback book. They are not written in long narrative stories. There are no myths, no royal biographies, no dramatic letters of love or betrayal. The texts are painfully dull, and that's what makes them invaluable. There are receipts, there are grain rations, there are dowry contracts, temple donation ledgers, livestock distributions, lease renewals, and birth announcements. And there, nestled between routine entries about cattle and copper, appear signs of a household that once belonged to a royal woman. For a few years, her staff is regularly noted: her scribe, her steward, her chamber servant. Occasionally, her own seal is used, not the king suggesting she had authority in her own right. This wasn't rare in the ancient Near East. Queens could wield power, but it was delicate power, conditional. A queen was safe only as long as her alliances benefited the court, and then her staff disappears, all within a handful of entries, stated within the same season. Her steward's name is last seen in a tablet, discussing wine storage, then gone. Her scribe's name is marked with a note, reassigned to the northern granary, and then, like dominoes, her entire court dissolves, but not violently. There are no notes of execution, no recorded purges, just absence, as if the palace quietly swallowed its own shame. In that same layer of the palace, archaeologists found a storeroom filled with jars of dried reeds, damaged seal impressions, and broken loom weights. On the floor, packed into a shallow ditch, were 2 discarded seal molds, broken in half, and a long copper stylus, worn almost flat from use. These were tools of administration, of the queen's administration, discarded, but not destroyed. It's possible that when she vanished from the palace, her court was shut down hastily, her belongings stored, and the tools of her power buried to remove the risk of legacy. That's what kings often feared, not the women themselves, but memory of them. A queen whose name endured could give legitimacy to her children, her lineage, her house. To eliminate her future, one had to erase her past. But who would do this? And why? The palace logs offer a faint clue. A few seasons after the last mention of the queen's staff, a new name appears: Tiku, possibly a younger consort or daughter. She appears only once, but in the context of a ceremonial shipment linen, olive oil, and incense to the temple. The items sent are typical of a woman's gift. The name is new. The seal, though faint, carries a different design. It may be that Tiku replaced the unnamed queen, not just in the palace, but in the archives, and the fact that she's introduced without mention of a predecessor suggests clean break and intentional forgetting elsewhere in the city. The queen's erasure had subtle effects. Outside the palace, workers in the textile quarterware, women spun flax into thread, filed fewer reports during the transition period. A backlog of inspection notes emerges about 6 months later, as if paperwork had collapsed and then resumed under different oversight. One of those reports clothes a curious remark: cloth delivered for lady's storehouse, recipient unknown, seal missing. That sentence, carved into drying clay, is the administrative equivalent of a whisper. It's a sign of disarray, and perhaps mourning. In ancient cities, memory wasn't abstract, it was handled through objects. If your name stayed on clay, you stayed in the world, but if your name vanished, you did too. Modern scholars have tried to triangulate the queen's identity through seal fragments, titles, and palace correspondence. The most supported theory suggests she was of foreign origin, possibly Hurrian, or Mitanna married into the Alalak dynasty during a temporary alliance. When that alliance broke, or when regional politics shifted, her presence became inconvenient. This was a known strategy. The Hittites did it. The Egyptians did it. Marriages were currency, not romance. And when currency lost value, it was discarded. So, what happened to her? Did she flee? Did she retire to a temple? Was she executed quietly? One hypothesis, based on burial customs, proposes that she may have been sent to a remote estate and buried with no royal rights, a kind of living exile. Several unmarked female burials have been found outside the city walls, and while none can be identified conclusively, their grave goods are strangely elite. Bronze hairpins, carnelian beads, and polished mirrors. Was one of them hers? And if so, who buried her? The answer may lie not in the palace, but in the temple. Near the remains of the sacred precinct, a cache of small tokens was found, wedged behind a foundation stone. Among them, a carved bone spindle whorl, 2 scarabs bearing the image of a woman in profile, and a clay figure with hands folded in prayer. This was no official offering. This was private. A small shrine, perhaps, built by someone who remembered her quietly. Outside protocol, it would not be the first time throughout ancient history. Women erased from public records were often remembered through unofficial rituals. A servant might leave a lock of hair in a crevice. A child might press a name into wet clay and bury it. These small, secret acts of remembrance were powerful, subversive even. They were history's footnotes, and, in the case of this forgotten queen, they might be all we have. One final thought. The people who erased her name were efficient, but not thorough. Her seal impressions, though damaged, were not completely destroyed. Her stylus, though buried, survived, and the ledgers, though cleansed of her titles, still showed the shape of her absence. You can see the gaps, the missing entries, the hesitation in a scribe's hand. Sometimes, silence speaks, and if we listen carefully, the queen they tried to forget becomes visible again, not through stories, but through systems, through the slight pause in a list, through a shipment sent to no one, through the fire that didn't reach her. Stylus, what would drive an entire palace to erase a woman so carefully? Was it fear, or something worse, indifference? Let your mind wander slowly, as if you're walking barefoot through a ruined corridor. The walls are broken now, sun-bleached and wind-cut. But once, they were smooth and painted in mineral reds and yellow ochre. You passed a place where the queen's quarters might have been, though no tablet says so directly. Still, here the floors are a little more refined. There's an extra drain, a painted door jamb, a line of crushed malachite pigment in the soil. This is not evidence. It's residue, and residue is all we have of her. The woman whose name vanished from every record, whose household was reassigned in silence, whose body may or may not lie in one of the undecorated graves outside Alalak's walls. This is the final section of her story, not a climax, but a slow fading. And yet, she didn't disappear completely. Let's look at how echoes are surviving when names do not. Historians call this kind of disappearance damnatio memoria, a deliberate act of erasing someone from historical memory. The phrase is Latin, but the concept is older, much older. And in the ancient Near East, it didn't necessarily involve smashing statues or burning scrolls. Sometimes, all it took was refusing to write a name again in Alalak. That refusal is eerily consistent after the queen's final season. No one refers to her again. Her scribe is reassigned. Her steward disappears. Her household is disbanded. Not one tablet says her name, not even in gossip, not even in correction. This wasn't oversight, it was precision. But there are faint impressions, still like shadows in wet clay. And one of them, perhaps the most revealing, is not in Ulalak at all. It is in Ugarit. Ugarit, another Bronze Age city-state to the west, had its own archives, and in one tablet small, rectangular, slightly burned a record survives of a diplomatic complaint. The tablet is fragmentary. But scholars reconstructed the text like this, regarding the woman of the house of Cap, whose messenger was turned away from the gate of Alalak. This is not as was promised. The offering has not been received. It is unsigned. There is no date, but the style of the script matches the period just after the queen's disappearance. Could this be a clue? Could it be that someone, perhaps a relative or ally, tried to send tribute or aid to her after she fell out of favor, only to be turned away? And if so, what does it say about the politics of her downfall? It suggests that her fall wasn't universally accepted, that somewhere in another palace she still mattered, that someone remembered, that someone tried to reach her, but Alalak did not respond. They didn't even send a return tablet. That, in itself, is unusual. In the polite, bureaucratic world of Bronze Age diplomacy, not responding to a message was deeply rude. Even enemies would at least acknowledge delivery. Silence meant something personal. It meant rejection, not just of the letter, but of the memory behind it. Elsewhere, a set of legal tablets from a rural estate outside Alalak begins to show unusual terms about inheritance. One reads, "If the woman bearing the signet of the West does not return, the yield of the olives shall pass to the son of Aksudu." Again, no name, but signet of the West is a curious phrase. It appears nowhere else in Alalak's archives. Scholars speculate that it could have been a euphemism, a way to refer to the exiled queen without breaking the rule of erasure. The scribe had to document the legal change in ownership, perhaps chose words carefully to avoid direct reference. So now we have two shadows, a diplomat who asks for her and a law that awaits her return. Neither names her, but both anticipate her presence and then both give up. This points to a common truth of ancient governance. Erasure wasn't permanent unless it worked its way into the habits of the living, and slowly, in the decades that followed, the living adjusted children born after her tenure never saw her seal. Servants trained after her fall never heard her commands. Even temple offerings that had once been designated for the Lady of the Southern Gate were redirected to a new patroness. Memory faded, not through conspiracy, but through routine. This is how most people are forgotten, not through hatred, but through the reshuffling of errands. But some threads survived. Almost accidentally, a recent study of faience bead production in the palace area revealed the curious layer of discard waste clay molds, misfired glass, and pigment chips alongside a child's grave. This child, a girl of about 6, had been buried hastily but carefully, wrapped in wool. Her grave goods were unusual. Among them, a tiny bead stamped with a seal no longer in use. At the palace, it matched the seal used by the erased queen's steward. How did it end up here? Was it a discarded trinket, a keepsake passed down from one servant to another, a forgotten piece of a forgotten court? And more importantly, who buried the child? Squeezed a bead from a condemned queen's household in the hand of a dead girl. Dead. Act small. Quiet. It's probably unthinking, may be the last physical connection to a woman. Its name no one dared write. It was not reverence. It was not ceremony. It was just continuity, the kind that survives in everyday gestures. So now we return to the question, why was she erased? Theories abound. She was a foreign queen whose alliance became a liability. Her presence in the court may have symbolized a treaty with another kingdom, perhaps Mitanni, perhaps a Hurrian house. If that treaty dissolved, her memory could have been considered dangerous. Erasure would remove the political residue. She was linked to a succession dispute. She bore sons who posed a threat to another royal heir. Removing her from the records would invalidate their claims. She committed an unknown offense. We will never know if she was accused of sacrilege, espionage, or treason. But none of that is written, okay? And the lack of condemnation suggests the offense, if any, was politically sensitive. It's too delicate to record, safer to forget. She died inconveniently. Perhaps she died during a diplomatic crisis, or in childbirth, or at the wrong time in the wrong place, creating rumors or instability. Rather than explain, the palace chose to move on in silence. None of these theories is provable, and that is the point. The system was designed to prevent proof, to sand down the grain of memory, until only smooth surface remained. And yet, the scar remains in every archive where a season is missing, in every tablet where a name is replaced with a title, in every law that waits for a return that never came, and in that bead, buried with a child, the queen they erased still breathes softly in. The gaps. You might wonder, why does this matter? If she is forgotten, and her name is gone, and her face was never carved, why do we still look? Because erasure in history is not the end. It's a choice, and choices leave patterns. And by reading those patterns, slowly, carefully, boringly, we do not resurrect the queen, but we do prove that she mattered, that she moved people, that she disrupted the system enough to require silence, and in the archive of silence, she lives now. The story ends here. There is no grand tomb to unveil, no name to shout across time, just this, a season of missing names, a shipment addressed to no one, a law that holds its breath, and a girl with a blue glass bead in her hand. You're sitting in a dry room. Dust settles in a thin film on the ground, disturbed only by the occasional sigh of wind through a narrow stone vent. The light that enters does not dance, it hesitates. You are not at the center of any empire. You are in a back room, storage cell for tablets, a place where few speak and even fewer listen. This is the scribe's room, not the royal one. The official chamber is far larger, where seals are pressed and messengers wait in silence for wax to dry. No, this is a room behind that room. Second chamber, windowless, tucked behind an antechamber where copies are made. And here, centuries ago, someone committed an act that almost no one noticed. They wrote a name that was not supposed to be written, and they buried it in clay. In the ancient Near East, power did not live in monuments. It lived in lists. Tablets than slabs of clay were everything. A person's title, their land, their grain, their loyalty, all of it was captured, not in sculpture, not in story, but in logograms, in cuneiform impressions pressed into damp earth, then dried until permanent. These were not merely records, they were laws. Memory, existence, to be written was to be real. To be erased was to exist. So when an entire generation of scribes was told to remove the name of a former queen, they didn't need an order carved in stone. They understood the process. They rewrote inventories, backdated marriage contracts. They quietly replaced old seals. The erasure was smooth, it was nearly perfect, except one tablet, one lone document that doesn't fit, filed under a mundane category grain shortfall, seasonal. This tablet appears like any other, but when translated, peculiar line sits buried between rations and taxes. The meal was prepared in the manner first taught by the Lady Iltani. This table was kept in the West Chamber. The Lady Iltani, that name appears nowhere else, and that is what makes it so significant, because by the time this tablet was inscribed, the Queen, now referred to only as the Lady of the South, had already vanished from every official record for over a decade. Was Iltani her name? Or was it a title? A pseudonym? A final whisper left behind by a scribe who remembered too much? Let's explore how a name can survive in silence. To understand what this act meant, must understand the role of the Bronze Age scribe. These were not mere copyists, they were memory keepers. Often trained from childhood, They worked for years before being trusted with official duties. They memorized old epics. They tracked weights and inventories. But more than that, they navigated. Loyalty. Every city had its own writing style, its own idioms, even its own favorite gods inscribed in specific orders. A trained scribe knew how to tell not just a story, but how to conceal one. What to write for the temple, what to write for the king, and what to write for the shelf that no one opened. The shelf for backup copies, for drafts, for assurance. In this context, the grain shortfall tablet becomes more than a ledger. It's a whisper. A scribe, possibly nearing retirement, seems to have chosen this moment to leave a mark. They didn't honor the queen outright. They didn't name her as royalty. They simply attributed a culinary custom, prepared in the manner first taught by the Lady Otani, to a name now forbidden. And that is how it begins. Small, quiet, but deliberate. Why grain? Why at this moment? Grain tablets were numerous, issued thousands. They were routine, checked only during dispute or famine, which made them ideal for hiding things. The entry in question lists rations for kitchen staff. It describes millet, emmer, wheat, and a small amount of cumin for ceremonial loaves. Ceremonial loaves were typically used in temple offerings. But the quantities here are wrong. They are too small for a proper temple feast, and too large for daily meals. That suggests a private ritual, a remembered practice, a dish no longer made for gods but still prepared for memory. The scribal note doesn't instruct anyone to replicate it. It simply notes it happened that the kitchen, out of routine or affection, still makes a bread in the manner first taught by the Lady Iltani. What was this dish? We can't know for sure, but several scholars point to a funerary bread prepared with honey and nuts, known in Hittite regions as nindasol, sometimes offered during private ancestor rites. If that's what this was, then the grain tablet becomes a memorial, a legal record of remembrance masquerading as inventory. A moment where personal grief flickered through official protocol. And that raises the next question. Who was the scribe? The tablet is unsigned. Most weren't. But cuneiform paleographers, the historians who study the shape and flow of ancient script, noticed something. The spacing of the glyphs matches only a handful of other tablets. Each scribe developed tiny habits, how they angled the wedge, how they ended a line, the way they spaced a glyph when writing under pressure. By comparing these quirks, researchers traced the tablet back to a known bureaucrat. His name was Amalanu. He served as assistant to the chief scribe of Alalak in the late 5th century BCE. Amalanu was not famous. Most of his work is dull border disputes, tax appeals, broken carts. But he was thorough, and here, what may have been one of his final tablets before retirement. He chose to remember a woman the state had raised, not loudly, not defiantly, but clearly, which means that in this back room, filled with dust and grain reports, someone chose not to forget. We might imagine Amilanu hunched at his bench. He is old now. His fingers don't press clay as smoothly. He works in a rhythm. Others have forgotten cursive cuneiform, not the sharper style of the younger scribes. He writes the daily record, then pauses, then adds a line. He's not supposed to. He waits for the gods to strike. They do not, so he seals it, files it, and goes home. And that one linen, one dull tablet survives, where all the queen's glory did not, because it was hidden in the boring and boredom. It turns out is harder to erase. What else might Amolanu have left behind? You're walking through the halls of a Bronze Age palace. But not the grand hall, no. Not the one with columns and incense and shining bronze fittings. You're somewhere beneath that. Somewhere plainer, quieter, and colder. The air has that heavy silence, like the inside of an unopened jar. You are looking for something that isn't supposed to be found, and what you're looking for is someone, but she has no tomb, no statue, no inscription on the lintel or ceremonial seal. The queen, known only as the Lady of the South, or possibly Iltanif, that was truly her name, vanished not just from the chronicles, but from the very architecture of memory, and yet her absence may be the clearest mark of all. Alalak was not a mighty capital. It was a mid-sized city in the region we now call the Levant near the Orontes River. During the 15th century BCE, it stood as a vassal under greater powers, balancing its politics between the Mitanni, the Egyptians, and the growing reach of the Hittites. Its palaces were modest compared to Thebes or Hattusa, but they were sturdy, mud brick over stone, built on layers older cities, crumbling beneath newer floors. In one such layer, archaeologists discovered a strange thing, a palace with a queen's chamber, but no burial. This chamber was set at the western edge of the palace, connected to the inner sanctum by a narrow hallway, decorated not with glory or conquest, but with frescoes of flowering reeds and carved waterbirds. The room was unusually long. No dais, no throne. But there were traces of furnishings, charred cedar beams that suggested a canopy, crushed shells used to inlay a dressing table, and fragments of polished obsidian, and in the corner, shattered pottery bearing the faint trace of a single glyph worn, nearly illegible. It might have said south, or it might have been the beginning of a name, but the chamber had been deliberately abandoned. The walls were plastered over. A newer floor poured above it. And then the entire section of palace-sealed that tells us something important. She wasn't buried there. She wasn't buried anywhere, you see. In this part of the world, during this period, queens were not always buried in royal tombs. Some were cremated, seen buried with the king. Others entombed in ceremonial vaults beneath temples. But when a queen disappears from every ritual text and leaves behind no grave, there is something else at work. Damnatio memoria, the condemnation of memory. And while the Romans made this practice famous scratching out faces, chipping away names, the Mesopotamian world had subtler ways. They didn't destroy, they rewrote. They attributed things to someone else, and they shifted timelines. To replace seals that condemn a woman like this required consensus. It wasn't done in fury. It was done slowly, officially, quietly. The question is, why? One theory, succession. The kings of Alalak did not always rule by bloodline. Sometimes by alliance, sometimes by appointment from greater empires. Marriages were political tools, especially with the Mitanni and Hittites. Watching from north and east, if the queen in question had a claim to power, perhaps as a sister to a rival king, her presence would be a liability after her husband's death. New regime might have chosen to remove her record to prevent future rebellion. But there's another clue. A Hittite text discovered far to the north and related, in theory mentions a diplomatic scandal involving a southern wife who refused the procession. In this context, refused the procession could mean she did not attend the coronation of the new ruler, or worse, that she challenged it. Is this connected to our vanished queen? Possibly, but it may never be proven. In that ambiguity, that boring gap, is where her story lives now. Let's return to the scribe. Amulanu, a quiet bureaucrat who added her name to a grain tablet, would have known the significance of what he was doing. He may have known her personally. Perhaps she fed his family. Perhaps she brought books to the palace. Perhaps she protected certain staff after a harsh winter. Or maybe they simply smiled at him once. In any case, her memory endured. Not because of legend, but because of food. Because of a dish passed down quietly. A ceremonial bread made during siege, grain festivals, It's always the small things that slip through the cracks. And perhaps that's the point. You might be wondering now, why would an entire city go to such lengths to bury a woman's legacy under the floorboards? What could she have done? There is another theory, a more human one. Some scholars suggest that the queen fell into disfavor, not because of war, but because of religion. Alalek stood at a crossroads of belief. To the north, the Hittites worshipped Tarhuns. To the south, the Canaanites worshipped Baal and Asherah. The Hurrians had their own pantheon entirely. An Egyptian influence brought in yet more gods. If the queen supported one cult over another, especially one seen as foreign, she might have found herself isolated politically. Some records even hint that she introduced foreign temple practices, possibly involving music, dance, and food rites. It's possible the Lady Iltani was remembered not as a rebel, but as a reformer, one who lost, and those who lose in this time are often erased. Still, she left a trace: the flower murals, the kitchen customs, the tablet in the back room, and the sealed chamber that no one used again. All these fragments, boring, unglamorous, graphic, tell the story of a person who was almost forgotten, but not entirely, because clay is stubborn, and memory, when it has no outlet, finds strange places to hide. Imagine the scribe once more at the edge of his life. Perhaps he lives with his daughter. Perhaps she keeps a recipe from the palace kitchens. Perhaps it's a bread with nuts and crushed dates, served on the first day of the barley season. They don't speak her name, but they bake it anyway. And that is how memory continues, not in statues, but in repetition, in rituals that no one questions, in shadows that stretch longer than stone. The queen with no tomb is still gone. Her face forgotten, her name uncertain, but in the record of a bread, in the fresco of a reed, in the sealed room built over with silence, she still exists. What else might be waiting beneath the plaster? There is something uncomfortably final about a sealed room, especially when the plaster is smooth, seamless, and undecorated. A wall that looks as if it was never meant to be anything else. No doorframe, no lintel, no faint mark of hinges or hinges removed. Just blankness, but silence, too. It's a kind of inscription. The final section of this story begins not with the queen, it's not with the scribe, and not even with the palace itself. It begins with the archaeologist, a woman named Chiseled, working in the late 1950s, who had come to Alalak not to find a mystery, but to catalog grain store layouts for a publication on late Bronze Age provisioning economies. A practical purpose, measurable, publishable, boring in the way true field work often is. She walked past the smooth plaster wall dozens of times. It stood at the far end of a corridor that was supposedly unfinished, with no doorway, just a 3-meter span of lime wash over mud brick, backed by retaining fill. But a graduate student, not Levy, noticed something strange. The sound of footsteps changed as you neared the wall, slightly, a soft echo, almost imperceptible. It was enough to make them curious. Later that season, when the wall was being measured for thickness, they tapped lightly with a trowel. A hollow thud. Then again, same sound. The team debated whether it was worth disturbing the structure. In the end, a small, exploratory shaft was approved. It took days to remove the fill behind the wall, and what they found was a room with no door, no stairs, no entrance at all. The sealed room was intact, almost eerily so. It contained no grand tomb, no sarcophagus, no treasure. Instead, a crushed wooden chair, collapsed long ago, a carved basin, broken at the rim, 2 spindle whorls near the back corner, and against the far wall, the fragments of a mural that seemed almost deliberately obscured by soot. The soot puzzled everyone. There was no hearth, no evidence of cooking, no fire pit or oil lamp holders. Eventually, they concluded the room had been deliberately smoked, perhaps a form of ritual purification before sealing, or an act of symbolic closure, the metaphorical burial of a space once occupied. And on the wall, beneath the smudge, faint lines became visible as the light shifted. Reeds, birds, a figure, in profile, once outlined in ochre, now only partially preserved. The figure was female, identified by the curve of the body and the presence of a plaited headdress. There was no name, but the position of the hand, raised in a gesture of blessing. In the presence of a small dog beside her feet, usual in royal imagery, suggested domesticity, intimacy. This wasn't a goddess. This was someone real. For weeks, Levy and her team argued over the room's purpose: a shrine, a memorial, a punishment chamber. The final report left it open-ended, possibly a domestic chamber repurposed for ritual containment. That phrase, ritual containment, became oddly popular in academic circles. It allowed for all possibilities without stating any. But a few months after publication, something unexpected arrived in the post: a private letter from an old scholar, Dr. Farid Harun, who had studied palace architecture in northern Mesopotamia. In the letter, Harun referenced a text from Nuzian Archive City in present-day Iraq, which mentioned the practice of consecrating memory by silence. He believed this sealed chamber at Alalak might have been a quiet tomb, a place not of burial, but of forgetting, a room built not to honor the queen, but to enclose her, to confine her story to one space, under one roof, and deny it the breath of being spoken aloud. It is difficult for modern minds to accept that memory could be so forcibly controlled. We live in a world of record, archive, redundancy. But in the late Bronze Age, oral repetition shaped power. Names survive through being spoken. Titles carried force through invocation. To be remembered was to still exist, even after death. So, to prevent a name from being spoken, to remove inscriptions spilled over murals in sealed chambers, that was a sentence worse than exile. It was a form of social annihilation. The queen of Alalak, perhaps Iltani, had been removed, not from the palace alone, but from the calendar of memory. And yet, she remained not in the records, but in the actions taken to silence her, and in the failure of that silence, because decades after Levy's discovery, a newer generation of archaeologists began re-examining the debris found in that room. One object had previously been cataloged as a decorative shell fragment, placed in storage, but a new scan revealed something surprising. The inside of the shell had been incised, very finely, invisible to the eye, but under angled light, a sequence of marks appeared, cuneiform, in Akkadian, but in Hurrian. It was not a name, it was a date, roughly translated, year of the closed gate, second moon. This is important because Alalak used a lunar calendar. The second moon referred to the month of purification rituals, and year of the closed gate was not a standard regnal title. It was an event. Something had happened in that year. Something involving closure, possibly of a temple, possibly of this very chamber. And someone, quietly, left a mark. A message to the future that something had been buried intentionally. But this section of the story isn't about discovery. It's about a concept. We call it subtractive memory. The idea that history isn't just built by what we include, but also by what we erase. An erasure requires effort. Someone had to plaster that wall. Someone had to burn that chamber. Someone had to commission new grain tablets that excluded her ceremonial role. And yet, for every one of those acts, another person left a contradiction, a recipe, a spindle, a dog carved beside the foot of a forgotten woman. It suggests a quiet resistance, not political, not rebellious, just personal, memory clinging in small details, waiting for time to shift. What happened to the woman who knew the emperor's true name? She was silenced. She was buried not in earth, but in whitewash and routine. Her memory was banished from the tongue, but not from the hand, and not from the floor plan of a palace that couldn't quite forget. You might imagine the servants still walking past that wall, still remembering the scent of her hair oil, still whispering stories to their children. Stories with no names, but stories nonetheless. There's a final irony to this. The act of erasure preserved her. Had she died quietly and been buried properly, her name might have been just another line in a tablet, the queen among dozens. But the effort to destroy her memory gave it shaped, find its edges, left behind clues in corners and ashes, an overlooked inventory, a spindle whirl out of place, a mural burned but not lost, a sealed room that hummed faintly when walked past. And so we closed the chamber once more, not with plaster, but with understanding. Her legacy isn't in what we know, it's in what we almost didn't. A ghost of bureaucracy, a smear of soot over beauty, a date scratched inside a shell, and a whisper in a hallway that no longer exists.